Hey everyone, I'm Nathan, your curator of curiosity, and welcome to the Curio Chronicles, recorded live here in Curioporium, right in the shop in our Wonderland studios. And this month is June. It's Gay Pride Month, and this episode we're going to be talking about gay pride and how it relates to Curioporium. For me, on a personal level, gay pride and curioporium do go together. There would not be one without the other. This is going to be a little bit of different type of podcast, but stick with me. Trust me. By the end of this podcast, when you come through the doors next time, you will see the gay pride that is hidden all around curioporium. So stay tuned for episode 5, Pride of Curiosity.
Yes, I wear foundation. Yes, I live with a man. Yes, I'm a middle-aged fag. But I know who I am, Val. Took me 20 years to get here, and I'm not going to let some idiot senator destroy that.
All right, everyone. So today we are going to be talking about Gay Pride Month. It's June, and we're also going to be talking about how it's had its impact on Curioporium. What does that mean? That is very strange to say Curiosity Shop holds kinship with Gay Pride, but there's a couple things I just want to get out of the way. I am old. Yes, I am old. I just turned 50 years old last November. I was born in the 70s, raised through the 80s and 90s. So for me, gay pride means something, very different than I think it does, say, for my 7-year-old daughter, my 21-year-old son, and my soon-to-be 17-year-old other daughter. It's very much a generational thing. So for this sake of this podcast, I am speaking from my generation. And when I talk about it, the term back then would be the gays. And what's meant by the gays is it was kind of a endearment lump sum term that included all the letters, everything. It was just called like the gays. I grew up in Hartford, and definitely during that time, had a lot of insight into the gay community with the gays, and that's what we're going to kind of start with. And if you are local, and you are from Hartford or around from Hartford, during the 80s and into the 90s, it's a rough couple neighborhoods. I lived kind of on the outskirts with my aunt, who had raised me, devout Catholic woman. Ma tante. Yes, my aunt in French. I am half French. And she raised me for most of my life when I was in elementary school and high school. And also, I had an older brother, about 8 years difference between us. And why are these two things important? I would say these are probably two of the most important gay figures in my life. And we'll kind of get into one of each of them and kind of how this whole thing of curiosity came about, but kind of formed by a young child growing up in the gay community. And what's funny about that, when I say that, is it was very much growing up in the gay community. If I start way back at the beginning, when the first time my mother had told me that my older brother was gay, I remember the only part of that conversation I remember is the start of it. And I remember at the end, and I must have been young. I don't know. I'm, maybe 11, maybe around there. But I do remember vividly, I didn't know what to think. I couldn't, all I knew was what was on TV or the jokes or so I didn't have any background. And I just remember you crying to my mother and her saying, "What?" And I said, "I don't want to be like him," not knowing what that meant. What did that even mean? I didn't know. It was just the only thing I could say. Um, and after that was kind of my induction into gay culture, gay society, or what it was back then in the late 80s, going into the 90s. And seeing this side of it, because remember, back then, for those of us who were old enough, to remember, this was something where it wasn't a month to be celebrated. It was still something that was, it was something that was getting to be tolerated, but really not on the forefront as it is today. And a lot of these individuals that I grew up with, and even these older gay individuals, I mean, they were the trailblazers that, for some of you young folks that are listening, really paved the way for some of the things that you don't have to experience. Back then, there's only certain places you could go. It was still very much behind the door. But from my abnormal upbringing, it was my norm. And just given that, even when I had friends in high school, it was always be, oh, your brother, he's gay, but he's okay. For I had some friends who were very culturally biased, let's say from the Portuguese community, and that just gay wasn't there, but it was acceptable. My brother was acceptable, and I can only think that that was because they got to know the culture from the inside out. I mean, my brother threw a couple birthday parties for some young Portuguese individuals when he lived down off of Washington Street. You know who I'm talking about, and it was it was like what it is now. What some people say, oh, it's the cool thing. It's gay went through that whole phase of it's cool. Everyone's coming out. Everyone's gay. Everyone's this. Everyone's that. But again, this is very much in the early '90s. So here I have my brother that is already older than me and out of the house and doing his thing, and here I am with being raised by my aunt, who is a devout Catholic. Um, and it's salt of the earth, and she was older, in her 60s. So, here I am, puberty, growing up, formative years, got this brother, who's, in the gay community. And then I've got my aunt, and, okay, how do those two go together? Well, my brother would stay at the house, things like that. So here I am like a sponge being exposed to all of these things. And if I put that against the first time my mother told me, it's a thing that I had forgotten for a while. It almost became, it was routine. It was my brother. It was, the people he had over. And we went everywhere when he had his apartment, and I'd go over, and I was still young, with all of his friends and the drag queens of old Hartford, you name it. There was a kind of a gay pride LGBTQ community center down in Hartford, I think a couple streets over from Trinity, and it was going to parties there and things like this. So being exposed, it was like just dropped into that culture of that time. And, when you have somebody in your family, and my brother and I always had a tumultuous, relationship at best, um, I did my thing of watching and the culture and how it grew and the hardships, and back then all the gay tropes that were there. And I mean, yes, some of them, yes, absolutely, the way of talking, but then it was like its own. To me, in one way, I was fascinated, I guess you could say. I was fascinated by just like this parallel culture that was emerging. And how did I feel about it? How did I feel around? My brother was young again. He was 8 years older than me, or something like that. Um, but of course, he had those mentors in the gay community who were a lot older, who worked for the state, or were social workers, or were some kind of therapists, and all of this. And getting exposed to those different age groups, in a way, I think back on it now, and I was very lucky. I will say I was very lucky to, one, be welcomed into that community, not just because my brother was such a big part of it, but I mean, just the involvement that some of these individuals had in my life, and what I was doing, and even through the years and teens, was very important. But what I was given was an unabashed look at just on one hand, pure creativity around some of the events, the gay pride events. There was balls called the Winter Ball down in Hartford. Um, being around those times, and I jumped timelines, um, going out to the clubs with my brother. There was only a few clubs, in Hartford. There was the Polo Club and the Shea were probably the two biggest clubs down in Hartford on, I think, what is it, towards Franklin Avenue, it was Weathersfield Avenue. And also me, going there with, whether it was at the time, my girlfriend, or now my wife, and seeing that whole side of a culture of a young man in my development, um, and also living with my brother. So there's all those kind of connotations of me in the middle. I've talked about me and my growing up, and you know, just this facet of being surrounded by all these gay individuals, and being surrounded. I mean, what, during summers, and hanging out at my brother's apartment, and the comings and goings and everything, and just the people that I was able to meet, but more at an earlier age. That whole thing of meeting a gay person, the gay community, for myself, went away. It was just friends. It was, my brother's boyfriend, people, coming in and out. And, to my friends, some of my friends, it was always weird. Some of them were, I'm a man's man, and this is kind of weird, but your brother buys us alcohol, so it's cool to go over his house and drink, but, ooh, they're gay. Um, and for myself, it did become a thing of, you have a gay brother, you have a cool gay brother who, gets us into the clubs and buys us drinks, and, when we're underage, and, it was kind of the cool thing. But again, it was still a lot of battles, and being so young, I never really saw those battles. I saw kind of one side of it, but not never. I never sat down with my brother and said, let's discuss this and my feelings and what does it mean to be gay. Um, but how it starts to relate to me in Curioporium is just like I said before, this curious culture that had its own ebbs and flows, that had its own language, ways of dressing, ways of design. It was just, I mean, to go over to his house, first and foremost, my brother's definitely a designer, interior designer, artist, and just the fabulousness of his apartments, and the curious spaces that he created. I mean, if my brother did not have a fainting couch that was gorgeous in some crushed velvet or burgundy, with designs on it, I mean, it wasn't a house, it wasn't a living room. If you didn't have the antiques and the bespoke things that were just so, you know, so I grew up looking and seeing this, and not just at his house but other people's house, and also the way of dress and the fashionistas that were there, as well as the drag queens. I mean, one of the biggest impacts was sitting there for my first drag show, because as a kid, meeting his friends and then seeing them on stage, and then reconciling that it's the same person, and what does drag really mean. And as I got older, taking on this just amazing art form. I mean, just sitting down at the Polo Lounge for the shows and the costumes, and seeing that is amazing. And I know a lot of straight people now, they love going to their drag queen bingo or drag brunches that a lot of places have and things like that. But back then there was none of those, But for me, what I one of the stories, or one of the things that I remember the most, that kind of intertwines everything for me, is I was living at my aunt's house, and I probably was freshman in high school. My brother would come in and out, and the my aunt was also a seamstress. So some of my memories is my aunt, devout Catholic woman. I mean, she loved the gays. She loved the gays. Of her putting and stitching sequins, hems on the dresses for the drag queens. So picture my aunt, very short French woman, very petite, very small, silver white hair, sitting at her old schoolish sewing machine in a room, and crucifix on the ceiling, and she's sewing the drag queens dresses. I mean, right there in that moment, it's a great dichotomy of who I am, because I'm there, I'm living there, I'm trying to become, a teen, and my brother and my sister, which we'll get into at another time, and these battles of being, a good student, but then partying, and then the gay culture and this, and it's all right there sewing dresses. And now that, and seeing the shows, the performances, going to the dance parties, some as I got older would DJ for him, and just the music and the culture. I mean, such a profound impact on me in terms of, let's just say, what I call curious design. Um, a lot of the things that I gravitate are from my brother, from what he exposed me to, exposing me to the tag sales, the Brimfields, the antique shows. And that aesthetic is so interwoven into me. To this day, I mean, my wife or my mother will say, "Oh, yep, that's a lot. That's what, that's a lot like your brother." So probably, and my brother and I have, like I said, it's a very tumultuous relationship. We go for years. Things happen. I think at this point, it's been over a decade. Um, my brother was one of the original founders of Curioporium, the original. I'm talking formulating the idea at Tisane. If you know Tisane, with him, of this thing we were going to do before everybody else, before what is Curioporium, and it's this person's, and I, before all of that, it was just my brother and I. And then through things, um, you know, in the first year, went our really separate ways, and I haven't, for tons of reasons, talked to him, or seen him or anything like that. And, he lives down in Florida next to my mother. But that impact, when Curioporium first opened, was very much the essence of him, was very much the aesthetic of him. And again, being a younger brother, and in my life and my problems of wanting people to see me and everyone's approval and things like that, I still was, and I still am, and will ever forever continue to be the little brother, even though I'm the middle child. I absolutely will. Um, but those nuanced things that were in the original Curioporium, even to the things that are in here now, have a profound foundation in me growing up in his community, in the Pride community. I mean, just, some people, it's a trope, gay people, antiques, and decorating, that's what gay people do. Well, you know what? It's true. Some of the most aesthetically pleasing things that I have seen, installations, interior design, has been. I mean, I can't, overstate that enough. And for me, growing up the way I did, it was just, I was sponging it and not knowing, like literally sponging it and not knowing. And that idea of curiosity and curiousness, definitely entered in. Like when my brother and I were living together and, we'd work Saturdays and, there's a whole thing on Saturdays where you come back from work and you chill out, you drink something, you eat something, you get dressed, and then you get ready to go out. My brother and I would go shopping for clothes. Now, this was during the era when I was definitely a lot younger. But yeah, my brother and I shopping at Marshall's in the women's section looking for bodysuits because back then it was like really big to wear tight bodysuits and like baggy jeans and stuff like that. So I, you know, that's another thing is like I had to be curious about women's clothes and how they would fit and how they would fit on how they would fit on me. Um, and then also, my brother, being, he's this is my straight brother. I've got to gay him up, and he would do my hair, and no, you need this, and you need a little bit of makeup here and everything, and I think during those times, in definitely in the '90s and even into the early 2000s, the culture was just so different, and one thing I can say between that time and now, it's definitely I'm seeing it through the lens of being 50 years old, but it was different. There wasn't, I don't want to say a sense of entitlement, but I feel now now there is a stronger voice for gays. There's definitely a stronger voice, a huge more acceptance. You can't really, I don't think, compare the two. But sometimes when I speak to, as I say again, this is the culture that I grew up with and the way we talk. When I talk to the old gays of Hartford, when some of them have come through Curioporium, and just the discussions of how it is now, and it's that whole thing of these are the youngins, and how many gay pride parades do they have to battle to, did they ever go to the original gay pride parade down in Hartford, or Pope Park, and then I put myself there where there with my brother screaming and dancing on floats and things, and to now, and when people come in, they generally don't know that was a major part of my background, and there was something about that was very comforting, that allowed this part of my brain, this fantasy part, because of course everything had to be wonderful. I mean, if Mother's Day or they were coming over for dinner, no, we're doing a Renaissance period dinner with the correct tablecloth settings, placements, food courses. And that's kind of where I got my love of entertaining and setting a scene, was really from my brother. I think it's only now, being at this age in the years of therapy I've gone through, I really can say that. Um, but it is like I'm sitting in Wonderland Studios. So Dark Wonderland has always been one of my things. But I'm looking at a table that I decorated. And literally, if you're in my family, my mother, sister, wife, the event Ray had at his house. I mean, he took the indoors and made it outdoors. Sofas, full dining sets, and there was such a whimsical feeling. It was before Curioporium. It was kind of what led us to open it. And just sitting, as I'm sitting outside under this tent with this Venetian fan going, and this table of just curiosities and wonderland things, and all of this, and one of those, I guess one of the deepest regrets is not at the time, because my brother and I don't express much emotion to each other, um that I say now, had such a profound impact on me, and formulating how I wanted to be curious and what I wanted to do. And I think partially we parted ways over Curioporium and things like that. I think partially that had a lot to do with it. Not seeing the forest through the trees type of thing. But It is. And when I said in earlier introduction about gay pride and things touching everything that when you come in here, it truly is. I mean, the fireplaces look so much like the fireplaces in my brother's apartments, the old apartments in Hartford. Hand painted, hand made to look like marble. I still use those techniques that I learned from him. The decorating, the costumes, from just being able to go backstage in some of these drag shows and just see the wonderful makeup and costumes and the bigger, the better has just stuck with me. And for myself, subconsciously on many levels, it enters into here. I may do it in a whimsical way. I may do it in a a horror way, which my brother does have. And I really never really said, okay, this is such a huge, huge part of my upbringing in the youth and what I was exposed to, that it just naturally embedded itself, I guess, in what I do here. It naturally embedded itself in the way I do events for like the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Just those types of things. I don't think I would feel so strongly this way or have the ability to do some of the things if I hadn't been immersed in that culture growing up and being exposed. I mean, it was all exposed out there. Granted, as I get older and you have a family and you're not going out to the clubs and you tend to go away, and then I wake up and I'm like, oh, it's 2026 and I need to learn more letters to add on to LGBTQ and say the right thing and they them and pronouns and all this stuff, and it's like, oh my god, for my head it's like the gays, like it is. I try. I know I've had some young people, they're like, you try, especially my daughter, like, you're trying. I asked my daughter a lot of questions. She's like, daddy, you're trying. You're trying to do the correct, pronouns and this and that. Um, but for me, it's like all still all under one roof, and it was very interesting as I hear people talking in the shop or other shop owners, and they're talking about the events for Gay Pride and where they're going to vend and do this, and I think back to that time in the '90s where there was none of that. Nobody was sitting around, you know, what parade are we going to go to? It's either you went to Hartford, New Haven, Boston, or New York. That was it. That was really it. And even Connecticut was, not that big, but that's where you had to go. And to hear people saying Middletown, Torrington, they're naming all these places that they're going to go to, and I'm like, wow, that's a long, long way. You know, it's a long way to some businesses which do define themselves as LGBTQ or gay stores. List just came up of gay businesses to support this month, and it was restaurants and things like that. There is none of that. There was none of that. And it's so great to see, but it's hard for me as a person to really relate to all this because it is so young and it does involve the younger movement, younger individuals, and it is, and it fascinates me. But they're that old culture enthralls me. Just I just the sense of we're doing this, we're doing drag, we're presenting our dance parties like this, we're doing whatever, was something that had, as I said, just piqued that curiosity in me. And having that profound impact, I think probably it's the openness. I mean, you have to be open in order to be curious. And That's the one thing I found with a lot of the great people I interact with, was just a unabashed openness. One, they're open, and hey, I'm gay, I'm loud, I'm proud, but just the things of that crossing cultural lines, because there was like subcultural lines. There was the Puerto Rican gays and the white gays, and the Asian gays, and there was all these you know ones. And interesting story, quick sideline, is when I was going out with my wife, then girlfriend at the time, we'd go to a lot of the clubs. My wife is wholly, she looks Asian, Korean. And back then it was, the sneaker boots, the belly ropes and crop tops. And, my wife, amazingly beautiful, would also wear either green or blue contacts. And, she was a little club kitten. She was a little club kitten, and she would just go. She was a dancer, so she'd go out and dance and bring me a drink, and I don't care as long as it's sweet. And I remember one time we went to a drag show, and there was this one drag queen, and she was also Asian, and for some reason hated my wife. Hated. It was just like this thing where we went to the club, it was like staring daggers at her. And one of the things, my wife, she wasn't from the U.S. She was born and raised in Brazil. So, of course, coming over, and, her views of gays also different. It's not, your typical Korean, and, being born and raised in Brazil. So, you know, that was always something to see. And, she came more on into the tail end of the partying and everything, because, of course, really after we married, it was very much separate from my brother. I mean, we had lived in apartments and houses together, and of course, it's, you're growing up, you're having a family, you got to move out, so it was, getting on separate. But it's moments like that if I sit around and my wife and I talk about, old gay Hartford, my 16-year-old, she just rolls her eyes. She's like, oh, man, but there was something to be said just about, I don't know, it was just difficult for me to put into words, but like how being with all these individuals and all these parts of the culture, I mean, it was music, it was art, it was fashion, it was design, and just informed me so much culturally, giving me such a base and appreciation. Hey, I don't wear designer clothes or fashion. I love fashion. I wear the exact, basically same thing every single day. Everything's black. I don't have to worry about changing. But I love fashion. I mean, and getting that from my brother, and fashion, and dressing and accessorizing. It is absolutely the same way I look at things in my store, whether it's a mannequin, a display. It's got to be dressed. It's got to have the right accessories. Does it match? If it doesn't match, sometimes that's great. Is it shabby chic? Oh my God, the words and this. And I remember, is it zhuzh it up? Look at this, Nathan. You got to zhuzh it up some more. He used to say, zhuzh it up. But I know what that means. And he would be like, oh, that's a very straight way of decorating that. Yeah, it was very, I was always like, God, that's just straight. Look at this straight way you're doing this. It's so straight. And here I am, 50 years old, sitting here, Curioporium, in Wonderland Studios, and I am looking around my shop, and like, my God, some of the pieces that I have in here, like furniture, is like furniture that he had, the same exact one, same style. Wow, okay. The couches, same exact style. The way these things are laid out on the shelf, where we have a lot of like kind of vintage clocks, and very much my brother. Italian Renaissance gold gilded clock with the cherubim's brother. Brother, absolutely. And I guess that was kind of my impetus for this episode, was, thinking about this month, just because I notice it's so much more apparent than years past, I guess. I mean, it's grown and grown and grown, but I don't know. It was just something that I was sitting there and it's been locked away, and I'm like, oh, wait a second. For me to say that the gays had such a hand in Curioporium is a thing that I know from those individuals that I grew up with at that time would be very proud to hear me say. Now, understand, I'm coming from my perspective of the way I grew up in the gay community that I grew up at the time I grew up. So, a lot of what I'm saying can fall on both sides. Some people understand, some people won't. Some, as they call it, individuals will say, "Well, you're not mentioning this or that." I'm mentioning my experience. And that's what's the great thing about I can mention and talk about my experience with the gay community and with these individuals and with my brother and his friends, boyfriends, and scanning spanning everything. And when I say that, and remember back then everything was lumped in together. Maybe sometimes you hear gay, lesbian, but it was pretty much lumped in. And also the infighting between the men gay and the women lesbians. That's a whole other thing, man. During the '90s, boy, that yeah. Um, but I, pardon using the word, but I take great pride in that. So if I go back to that time when my mother first told me that my brother was gay, when I had said to her, crying, I don't want to be like him, not knowing what that meant, to now, what, 40 years? I am so much like my brother, for better and for worse, because the things that he exposed me during this very formative time in my life has become part of me, has been ingrained in me. If I put aside all the hardships and the things in our failed relationship and all that, and put those aside, I can say this and wholeheartedly that because of you, this has come out of that. And for me, that's very hard to say because for a lot of times, don't mention much, don't say much, people don't know that I have, brothers and sisters. There's even ones we don't know about. Well, we do know about them, but that's a whole other podcast. It does, in a way, span the familial bonds a little bit because I think my brother would understand when I talk about curiosity that it's in the service of the curiosity that all this has stuck with me. It's something bigger than him. It's bigger than me. I think it is something we, probably only share in common, but that profound impact that I didn't know was going to happen back then, bringing it to now, was tough for me to face, was tough for me to see. So when I see the signs, of course, everything is going to be gay pride, online signs, flags, everything. This year has a different meaning for me. From right now where I am in my life and who I'm trying to be, it has a very different meaning. And probably for me, maybe a little bit hard. Sorry. Maybe a little bit hard. But I never thanked the community and those people who took me under their wing as their little brother for their little sister. Hey, little sister. Yeah, some people call it, And to think that back when I was a child, sitting there saying, I don't want to be like him. It's a tough thing to swallow, being who I am right now. As my therapist would say, now you're crying. I may not have a relationship with my brother, but I do. When I come in here, there's so many things, as I said before, that remind me of him that have just come out organically, naturally. So a big part of this whole curious thing of where I get it from definitely has to be from him, from seeing the community, of giving me that base, giving me that foundation to grow it into to what it is. And I just thought that, just discussing it a little bit more can open up more conversations. I think it's another interesting facet that I know a lot of people know how, personal Curioporium is. And I've had a lot of conversations about the personal items in here and, trauma and childhood and all this. But this is just maybe one other thing that you didn't know. It's just one little other side of me that has, when people say, how were you able to do this? Well, here's one of the big foundational building blocks of how I was able to do it. Was my brother introducing me to the gay community at a young age, and all the wonderful people that I met, in the divas, in the queens. It's just a wonderful. And I think all of them together, the biggest thing for them was, the openness of what can be done, not being defined by a label, going out there, doing you, being unabashedly yourself, whether you're gay, straight, bi, tri, poly, whatever. And just remember, please, always stay curious. Thank you, everyone. I am Nathan, your curator of curiosity, and thank you for joining me on this episode of the Curio Chronicles. Have a good one.